afternoon. Thank you all for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 1 meeting. This is for the Supply Commitment and Resource Efficiency Evaluation topics. I'm Christina Osborne, representing ISO's Stakeholder Affairs Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. I'm also joined by Mark Richardson, who is the facilitator, and Bob Cott, who is the scribe for this working group. And then I also have Phil Pettengill on the line, who is the coordinator overseeing all three of the EDAM working groups. And then, as noted on this slide, this working group meets on Mondays and Wednesdays from 1 to 3. And again, you can find the participation details for those meetings on ISO's public calendar. For today's meeting, Mark's going to continue the discussion on the treatment of imports for purposes of Rsc. And then after that, he'll tee up the discussion on Rsc failure consequences. And then Bob, at the end, will summarize the discussion, and Mark will review the topics for next week's meeting. And just a couple of reminders. These working group meetings are intended to be collaborative, and we do encourage you to ask questions and share your perspectives on the topics. So please feel free at any time to raise your hand, and Mark will call on you. We just ask that you start by stating your name and affiliation. These meetings are recorded, and we do post the video files on the associated working group web pages, where you'll find other materials to these meetings. The recordings and any other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And if you are interested in presenting at an upcoming working group meeting, please let us know by using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation, and we will reach out to you to coordinate the logistics for that meeting. So I will go ahead now and turn it over to Mark Richardson.
Thank you, Christina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks, Mark.
All right. Good afternoon, team, and thank you again for your time today. I know everyone has had an extremely busy day with back-to-back meetings, and I wanted to apologize for not getting these slides posted prior to the call. I do have a few slides that I wanted stakeholder feedback on prior to posting, so I actually think it worked out, coincidentally well. Today, as Christina mentioned, we're going to definitely continue our discussion on the treatment of imports as it pertains to the Rsc qualification and counting, touch a little bit on import RA, and then hopefully get into the failure consequences discussion. Next slide, Christina. All right, so what I did here, so in red this is my take back from the call, so I apologize if it's inaccurate, and this is actually why I'm glad we did not post these slides prior to the call. I'm really looking for stakeholder feedback here. So this slide was actually presented in Monday's call without the red answers there. And what I did was try to summarize at a generally high level kind of the commonalities with the different arrangements and what I believe to be the answers to these questions. So the first one, what are and do these arrangements look like? I heard from the last call, these are firm energy and are unable to curtail due to economic reasons. When is the source and transmission path known? This varied. So what I captured here was there's no uniformity across the Western Interconnect. I heard some Southwest parties mention they may not know till closer to 1400, whereas some of the Pacific Northwest parties were closer to that 8 or 9 a.m. timeline. Is the delivery point to the system static or dynamic? The point of delivery is known upon execution of this arrangement or agreement, and I believe that agreement also included volume, shape of the product, and which counterparty you are engaging with for that agreement. I believe I also heard that the point of delivery is static for the duration of that agreement. And then lastly, level of certainty around these megawatts being delivered. Most parties refer to these arrangements as reliable. So let me pause there and get a gauge for the audience of how far off I am. I will definitely take notes on each one of these points prior to posting this, just so we're at least accurately reflecting each one of these items here. So let me pause there and see if I can get some feedback or hands raised from the audience. I see Jeff Nelson. Thank you, Jeff. Go ahead.
The line has been unmuted.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. A comment came up that some people didn't consider exports from the ISO as firm. I was wondering if someone could comment on that. Maybe this is a wrong place, but I wonder if someone could comment that.
So I actually do recall that statement. I know I had Danny Johnson. I believe he's in the attendee list there. Danny, did you want to raise your hand and opine on that from an ISO standpoint regarding export firmness? Go ahead,
Please
Danny.
go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, I think I would just point everybody back to the CAISO's existing tariff and BPMs that detail how exports from the CAISO were treated. I don't really want to get into those in this working group if we can avoid it. Thanks.
All right. Hopefully that helped, Jeff. Operator, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Jeff's line, I want to make sure that helped him and fully captured maybe anything else he wanted to add.
For politeness sake, I'll just say I'm not sure that helped.
All right. Thank you for your comment, Jeff. Let me go to Paul Wood.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Hi, Paul Wood from Pacificor. I guess to follow up on that comment about exports out of Cal ISO, from our perspective, or perhaps my perspective, I deem those as when I'm buying from somebody who is taking out of California to serve that obligation to me, I consider that a firm purchase at whatever agreed upon POD we have. But I also recognize that the Cal ISO does have the ability, I guess, to curtail those exports. But if that happens, I hold the person who sold me the energy, they're on the hook as a Schedule C, WSDP Schedule C product that I bought from them. They are who I expect to keep me whole. As to your comments on slide 5, my only point would be on, when is the source and transmission path known? Since there's really no defined cutoff time, our only expectation is that, schedules, everything has to be tidied up and put to bed by, 3 p.m. Certainly the vast majority of those bilateral transactions we enter into with counterparties, they are pathed and tagged, well before that. But it, as people have said, it can, take until 1400 before, things are fully tagged.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. And just for clarity's sake, my 13 to 1400 reference and Paul's 3 p.m. reference is before the trading day, so T-1. All right, let's move on to Carrie.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I would just like to continue my request for additional clarity when we talk about firm energy. I think what you mean here is the arrangements are reasonably reliable. I understand that in the bilateral market, right, you could have firm and non-firm energy, and neither of those will be economically curtailed, although they do have different curtailment priorities. So I keep getting confused by the specific language, and I think it would be really helpful to specify under what circumstances we actually mean reasonably reliable versus firm. So that's my first thought. And then my second thought is, again, I would like to request just a discussion or a mapping between bilateral levels of firmness and then the CAISO's export firmness, because at some point we'll have to talk about that. And maybe what Danny was saying is this is not the appropriate working group to talk about it, but we'll have to have reciprocal firmness and translate bilateral priorities into CAISO self-schedule priorities. And maybe you could comment on when we'll talk about that or where it'd be appropriate. But I do take Jeff's point and think we do need to talk about his question at some point. Thanks.
Thank you, Carrie. And for the firm energy comment, that is just a term I heard several times on Monday. Various entities talked about, in the past decade or two, not seeing these type of arrangements curtailed. So I would actually call on, some of those entities to the extent they're comfortable to address your firm energy related question. To, whether or not exports and, level of priority and things like that, I don't want to get into that today. I've made a note here to take back to the ISO team and, have that conversation and see where it best fits, whether it's in this working group or the transmission working group, but where that may best fit. So I appreciate that, and I've made a comment there. Let's go to Jeff.
Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, good afternoon. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX. Just Mark, confirming that you can hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, good. Thank you. I just wanted to support some of the comments Paul Wood was making with respect to the nature of these contracts and the timing. And it's pretty similar to a lot of the comments that we heard last time from some of the other entities as well that were talking about the scheduling practices across the West associated with Schedule C energy products. And I think the bullet points that you have are pretty reasonable descriptions of that, except for the one that I was going to highlight was the second one around when is the source and the transmission path known, and just support what Paul said, which is it certainly varies within that scheduling period day ahead, and some are known earlier than others, but the standard deadline that is applicable for the vast majority of those contract schedules is that 3 p.m. day ahead tagging deadline. So from our point of view,
I can add it.
And the reason I say that is from our point of view, when we're just backing up to talking about what kind of supply should be included in a day-ahead resource sufficiency test. Obviously there's some timing issues that we need to sort through and when all this information is known, but just fundamentally, I think at the bare minimum, the expectation should be that if you're counting an import towards meeting your day-ahead resource sufficiency, that it should have a day-ahead ETAG by the end of that 3 p.m. day-ahead deadline. So, I think that would, ideally we'd have more information at the time that the market is running to try to, make sure that all of the additional information around the delivery point and transmissions all sorted out. But at a bare minimum, I think that day-ahead timeline should be respected for purposes of the Rsc.
Sure. I'll add a note to the extent everyone agrees. While the timing does vary, it sounds like a standard practice across the West to have the tagging in at 1500, or at least the source and transmission path known by 1500. Thank you, Jeff.
And the ETAG. Yeah, that's correct. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that.
All right. Let's go to, I saw Danny Johnson hands up. Go ahead, Danny.
Thanks, Mark. So I kind of wanted to follow up with Jeff. I heard you say that you thought a day-ahead ETAG is pretty uniform for the Wsdps and is usually in by 3 p.m. I'm trying to connect the dots and figure out how that's applicable to the Rsc if we're running that at 10 a.m. before we run the day-ahead market and then are running the day-ahead market based off that result. So I'm not quite sure how the timing of this lines up to making the Rsc a better test of if resources are going to be in place when we run the day-ahead market.
So, event producer, if you don't mind unmuting Jeff Spires' line.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Danny. It's Jeff Spires again. I appreciate that comment, and I agree with you that there's a challenge there. I mean, ideally, we would have all of this information before the market runs, but I think that's part of the issue here is just trying to find the timelines that make sense and figure out what information is available at the time that the market runs, and how do we use what we do know the best we can at that point in time. And hopefully, I would hope that the other thing that would start to happen is that entities would, to the extent that it's possible, adjust some of their scheduling practices. May not always be possible to do so, but at least in some cases. But I think the point I was trying to make is that I think the expectation would be that if you're including supply at that earlier time, whenever the test is performed, that by the time you get to the end of the day, you're going to have an e-tag to support that. And so, one mechanism to address that would be to say if the tags don't show up by that 3 p.m. time frame, then that has some repercussion for the test on a forward basis for some future period, whether you're some kind of methodology to address the fact that it didn't live up to the expectation that by the time you get to 3 p.m. it's tagged. So I think you're right that at the time of the test itself, that hasn't necessarily occurred, but I think the expectation is that it should be coming in within that day ahead time frame so that the supply can be validated before the end of the scheduling window.
When you say validated before the end of the scheduling window, you're referring to like the day ahead pre-scheduling process in the OAT world?
Yes.
Okay.
3 p.m.
Thank you.
3 p.m. day ahead deadline.
Perfect. All right, let's go to Dan Williams.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Mark. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just wanted to offer up a comment kind of around some of that discussion of the firmness of exports from the CAISO. And I think this goes a little bit to the meeting from this morning of wanting to have that kind of EDAM 101, everybody getting sort of on the same page about the long-term vision. But I think there definitely is an issue to be explored about the firmness in the context of the existing market and kind of conventions that are there around it in the market today. But we're here talking about EDAM, so what really matters for the purpose of identifying this is what those the firmness of those types of transactions and exports in the context of EDAM, and what we think will persist in terms of how Wsdp Schedule C agreements or other transactions will continue to be used or be in place. And I think we've already identified maybe in some of the other work groups that we expect entities to continue to use those types of transactions for maybe trading source specific power kind of outside of the EDAM transfers. But is there a world in which we think that entities will be making a Schedule C purchase and then thinking that someone's going to export from the EDAM to sort of fill that sale, and that doesn't really hold together for me. It seems more like we would just be entering into a different paradigm where you're trying to have some parity of how entities are transacting on a forward basis, and then how that's being brought to the EDAM and sort of facilitated through the running of the IFM and establishing those EDAM transfers. So hopefully that makes some sense and kind of maybe helps clarify where we need to do more thinking and where we can maybe set aside some of the issues that are specific to today. Though I'll also say that a lot of that depends on sort of the comprehensiveness of the market, which is why I get back to that need for the EDAM 101 kind of discussion between entities.
Thank you, Dan. And I definitely, I heard Milos in the previous meeting this morning make a note and take that back and confer with the ISO on the need for that EDAM 101 as we get closer to these working groups. And I agree, I think everyone realizes the export conversation needs to happen. And I made a note of that per Carrie's comment, and we'll definitely see where that's going to come back, and we'll communicate accordingly for which associated working group that's going to be discussed in.
Yeah, and it's just kind of the inverse of some of the examples that George went through last time of like, let's assume, just since PacifiCorp was just talking that, they're in the EDAM, what do those transactions look like sourced from CAISO going to PacifiCorp in the future in the context of an EDAM? And then let's say there's another BA that's not in EDAM, then how is that firmness of the exports conversation different for that transfer from a CAISO EDAM BA to a non-EDAM BA? What does that establish for a CAISO obligation for RSC, if anything? And kind of what are the other expectations around it?
Gotcha. Thank you. All right, let's go to Stuart Kelly.
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, thanks, Mark. I just want to pick up on the comment around timelines. When are we going to produce a sort of before EDAM and, with EDAM timeline? I get the sense, and just listening to some of the other working groups as well, when they're talking about EDAM 101, that we're probably nearing that opportunity to create that timeline now, just in terms of how we think EDAM might work. It obviously won't necessarily be cast in stone. It may be an initial draft, but I think it would be helpful in a couple of different ways. In particular, thinking about the knock-on consequences of some of these timelines, be it whatever bilaterals, whatever schedules that you're trying to arrange. Paul Wood previously commented on some challenges around gas purchases, and I don't think Pacificor will be the only one that may have to rethink about potentially how they purchase gas based on that timeline, as well as, even if a tie to the working group, building on what we discussed this morning, what that actual, from transmission and transmission planning, what we anticipate, be it on a day-ahead basis, for the markets to run at 9 or have an optimization or some run within the VA at 9 before the market starts to run at 10. Do we all agree that we would benefit hugely from at least a draft of that can be refined over time based on what we know thus far, or does everyone disagree?
Yeah, so prior to, having parties opine on that, for purposes of RSC, I think the conversation to this point has been that, for lack of better words, that on-demand advisory RSC run, that entities have the ability to execute as they move forward, becoming supply sufficient within their own BAA, and then that 9 a.m. scheduled advisory run with 10 a.m. being the associated deadline. So while I understand there's a need for an overall EDAM timeline, structure or graphic thrown out there to help everyone conceptualize the different market processes and things like that, I believe the vision was just an extension of the CAISO day-ahead market, right? And I'm not sure if that impedes on or changes any of the associated tagging deadlines and things like that already exist today. I would ask the California entities how they manage their gas supply and what they do for entities participating in our day-ahead market. I see Melos just put his hand up. Hold on one second, Stuart. He may correct me or further clarify. So let me go to Melos first.
It will, Mark. There's a lot of work done between 9 and noon for one, and just how the gas is typically purchased for some of the utilities in California. It definitely does. You made an important statement there in terms of just following the existing timeline. That's fine. And if there's a co-optimization of all those various products out of that market run, let's just state it. You don't have to decide on tie bidding to the extent tie bidding is going to happen. What do you expect day ahead? What do you expect time in real time? What do you expect from real time? These components are important because it has a significant operational impact. And I would like to see that timeline now to the extent that, and that's what you've alluded to, we've discussed some of it in this working stream, which is great, but to the extent it's not going to change, let's just, get it out there.
Thank you, Stuart. Melos, event producer, can you unmute Melos's line, please?
Sure. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. And thanks, Stuart, for the question. I think, Stuart, what you're asking seems reasonable. I think what you're stating is we've made enough progress across all three of these working groups that we can maybe start charting out that timeline. In the resource sufficiency evaluation, we're talking about certain activities that need to take place by a particular time frame, when the market is run, when resources are locked down, and when the resource sufficiency evaluation occurs, when the tagging occurs. And then in the transmission group, we're already talking about when transmission is made available and the timing of that. I think that's a reasonable ask. Let us go back and figure out how we can start putting together a draft timeline that, can get then populated as we further evolve the design framework through these working group discussions. And if that helps further the discussion, I think we can certainly take that back and look to put something like that together. Did I get your concept right, Stuart? I mean, basically what you're saying is, we made progress across these working groups enough that we can chart out a timeline of when certain activities need to take place under the design framework that we've discussed thus far.
Event producer, do you mind unmuting Stuart's line, please?
Sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah, Milos, exactly. You captured it exactly correctly. And I think also, as I say, it'll be informative, potentially for others, including myself, that, based on the discussions and comments I'm hearing and the need to go back to 101s or whatever, that will be hugely informative. And it will also yield other questions, operationally, how we need to adjust and some of the challenges that may come from that. And then critically, as we get into the finer points of some of these conversations here and the various working streams, it's a good backdrop to have, even though it's not cast in stone. So completely correct,
yeah.
Milos. We have it the better.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Great suggestion. Yeah, let me take that back. Let us look to put something like that together here in the coming week or so, and so that we can put out there and then reference as we go through, the remaining discussions in the working groups. I appreciate that suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Milos, and thank you, Stuart. All right, Jeff, I still see your hand up. I'm not sure if that was just left over from your previous comment. It looks like he put his hand down. All right, so I heard feedback on, updating the bullet item there in the second item, whereas when is the source and transmission path known? So I'll make that associated update prior to posting these slides. Thank you, everyone, for your feedback here. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so based on the conversation we just had and Monday's conversation, I believe what the ISO needs, and ISO team, please feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm incorrect here for what I captured, is the ISO is in need of a bid, a sales schedule, reflected at the point of delivery with an associated megawatt volume to account and give credit to that EDAM entity BAA for passing the RSC. With that being stated, is this feasible based on what we know now regarding Wsdp Schedule C arrangements? Right, I heard the 1500 deadline, but can a self-schedule bid be provided reflecting the point of delivery with an associated megawatt volume by the 10 a.m. bid deadline that we currently have envisioned? Tong, I see your hand up. Go ahead, Tong.
Please go ahead.
This is Tong Wu from WAPA. First, I have a comment, then I have a question. My comment is that Schedule C energy is very reliable because there is a liquidated damage clause. So if the supplier does not provide, and then there is a penalty. Also, it's a take or pay contract, meaning that the buyer has to take it. They're on the hook to pay anyway, regardless whether they want it or not, unless there is a, say, transmission outage in real time that can be considered as a force majeure. So it's very reliable. So that's my comment. So I think as far as RSE is concerned, it's very safe to consider to allow Schedule C firm energy as a supply. Now my question is,
thank you. Hold on, Tom. Before you go there, so thank you for the way you just laid that out. If you don't mind, before asking your question, is it possible for an entity to reflect in a bid the point of delivery and megawatt volume for that Wsdp Schedule C contract by the current 10 a.m. deadline?
Yeah, by 9 a.m., I don't think there's a problem because the contract says where the delivery point is. That's certain. There might be some nuance there. So, for example, delivery point could be COP, but really the scheduling point could be Malin.
Understood.
But that's not, a big deal. So the question is that how do you know when somebody submitted a bid, this bid is backed up by Schedule C? Because there are other schedules that you can use, for example, unit contingent. So that's not a Schedule C. So if a unit is out of service or for some reason they don't have to deliver, it's a unit contingent. So that's not as good as Schedule C. Now I don't know whether ISO's export is Schedule C or unit contingent. I'm not going to get into that. But how do you flag this in this bid, or do you require that kind of information?
No, that's a great question, and I don't know if other parties want to speak up on behalf of the unit contingent comment, or if the ISO would like to raise their hand and opine on how you may have envisioned this for these other types of contracts. In the next slide, we are going to talk a little bit about import RA into CAISO, so I will ask everyone to hold off on that. But any takers willing to raise their hand and speak on this? I would like to potentially hear from some of the EIM entities and California IOUs that help put together these common design elements if this was brought up in those discussions as well. I see Paul Wood from Pacificor, so thank you, Paul. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, Paul Wood at Pacificor. I guess from my perspective or Pacificor's perspective, if we're short and we're trying to set up for the day ahead, we're not picking up non-firm schedules or non-firm transactions. The type of bilateral transactions we're in the market procuring, starting at maybe 5 a.m., 5:30 a.m. up until we get the amount of megawatts we want, we're buying WSPP Schedule C, which is, others have described as, those are firm transactions. I know the volume and I know exactly where I'm picking it up from. I know that as soon as I enter into those transactions, those bilateral transactions in the market, those have to be counted, from my perspective, towards me passing a sufficiency test. Now, if I'm satisfied I have enough length, enough transactions, Schedule C transactions, and maybe because I want to get a little bit more, I can buy a Schedule B product, Schedule B product being non-firm. Those can, I can do that, but they shouldn't be considered for me passing the sufficiency test. Only those Schedule B transactions.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So can I hear from other entities if that is their understanding as well, is, these unit contingent or, Schedule B type arrangements should not be counted towards RSC? Is that agreement? And I'm going to do an awkward pause here because I really need to hear from some of the EIM entities as well as California PTOs. I see Milosh with his hand up. Go ahead, Milosh.
This is Milosh with the California ISO, and the common design principles, and I think other parties that discussed this at the last meeting as well. But there's a recognition that these have to be firm energy arrangements, and I'm not sure that the other schedules, and maybe that's what you were getting at, Tong and Paul, is I don't know if those can be qualified as firm energy arrangements as opposed to non-firm, and others can opine on this as well. But I think the distinction in my mind is, for firm energy arrangements, those cannot be just not performed upon at the discretion of the supplier. There's specific limitations in those contracts, and that I think force majeure or reliability events is what usually the contracts note, and that's what denotes some of these firm arrangements. Non-firm arrangements, I think, allow the discretion of the supplier to perform or not. But that's the distinction in my mind between firm and non-firm, and the concept behind the common design principles was that EDAM transfers, have to have a certain dependency to it, and therefore, some of these arrangements have to be firm energy arrangements. And I think this is consistent with import RA in California, which has to be firm energy arrangement. I think this is consistent with some of the expectations of the EIM entities as well that contract for these Wsdp Schedule C arrangements. These are firm energy contracts, like Paul said. So anything I think that is non-firm, and I'm not talking about transmission, I'm talking about the energy itself. I don't know that, I don't think that's necessarily consistent with the common design principles, but I don't think that that's necessarily consistent with the intent, behind these EDAM transfers being supported by reliable transactions, reliable energy. And if it's non-firm, and it could be, the seller could choose not to perform at their discretion, I think that impacts the reliability of EDAM transfers. And hopefully that helps, Mark, but feel free to open it up to others as well.
Thank you, Milos. I think that helps level set with everybody. And, to the extent we have individuals on this call that don't necessarily agree with that, now's the time to vet that. So, Jeff Nelson.
Hi again. I'll take my hand down now before I forget. I think Milos captured it pretty well there, the concept of sort of firm transactions. I do think unit contingent is something that shouldn't be just excluded immediately. I mean, I'm just doing by analogy. I mean, if you have a unit within your own balancing authority and you're showing that unit as part of your RSC, frankly, those bids are unit contingent. So I'm not quite sure why, if you were showing an import, that it wouldn't count like a resource within a balancing authority would count, as long as it was firm, but unit contingent. I guess there's a secondary motion or second layer there of how reliable that unit contingent unit actually is. So maybe there's a nuance there, but if bids within a balancing authority from units are in effect unit contingent. That's all.
Yeah, and maybe for my own knowledge, do you mind defining, or to the best of your knowledge, what exactly is unit contingent, just so we can level set that with the audience?
So it's been 20-some years since I did these type of deals, so it may have evolved, but you'd actually point to a specific generating facility, and you'd say, look, I'm giving you power out of generator X, and as long as generator X is capable of giving you the power, I will give you the power. But if generator X trips, deal's off. Or if generator X won't start, I guess technically deal's off. And
Understood.
that do this daily and more recent than me should chime in if I've got it wrong.
Thank you. All right, let me go to Jeff Spires, and then I'm going to go to Dan Williams.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks. Hi, it's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I was actually just going to make a really similar point to what Jeff Nelson just did, and saying that I think unit contingent is different from non-firm for much of what the same reasons that Jeff just described. I mean, non-firm is one thing because I think as Milos was getting at, it can be interrupted for basically any reason. And so, the ability for an entity to rely on that resource or on that schedule for anything other than just energy displacing a resource within their own BA, there's not much else you can do beyond that, because it could go away at any moment for any reason. But unit contingent, I think we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about that. And you just take, for example, you've got a gas plant within your BA. I think the expectation is it's being included. If it happens to be that gas plant is a remote resource but otherwise it's the identical facility. It's just that you're bringing it into your system from some other location. I think the expectation would still be that you would be able to use that resource. I think from our perspective, though, where this kind of starts to come back to, whether we're talking about firm, kind of more system-based transactions or unit contingent that are specific resources and the contract is predicated on that single unit operating. I think that the common theme and perspective that we have on that is that those should be identified in that day-ahead time frame. And so that's why I was saying before that, I don't think from our point of view, submitting a bid without any further information is enough to be counting this supply in the day-ahead resource sufficiency test. I think that at a minimum, there should be a requirement that import, whatever it is ultimately supported with an E-tag by the end of the day-ahead time frame, so that there is an ability to see where that's coming from and that it is legitimately something that's going to be delivered. So, just kind of wanted to make a couple of those points again. Thank you.
No, thank you. Let's go to Dan.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Dan from Customized Energy Solutions. So Jeff and Jeff both covered most of what I wanted to say, but just the initial reaction on some of the non-firm stuff is probably just something to keep an eye on for EIM in the context of EDAM or in the presence of EDAM. If non-firm power is traded, that should get picked up in the ancillary service requirements and counted as part of the resource sufficiency evaluation. Whether that's happening in day ahead or in real time, it's just generally you carry 1-for-1 reserves if you're buying a non-firm product, and so that would be, you can still buy the energy, but you have to have the capacity on your system to pick it up, so it's ending up getting counted on maybe just different sides of the ledger in the RSC anyway.
Thank you, Dan. I see Danny with his hand up. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Dan said, and you're saying it's a 1-to-1, so you would want to add to your AS requirement, but if you're getting credit for your energy requirement, but adding an equal amount to your AS requirement, it kind of nets out to not being able to help you pass the RSC in your example.
Let's unmute Dan Williams in that producer.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah, all that just to say yes. Thanks, Danny. Assuming that the ancillary service requirements are getting picked up appropriately and accounted for appropriately.
Okay, thank you.
So is it safe for me to summarize or state, for context of EDAM RSC, only highly reliable energy transactions will be counted towards the RSC? I believe that's what I'm hearing. It sounds like that was the original intent, and based on some of the comments I've heard to this point, that sounds consistent with that. I see Kevin Smith.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted. Please unmute the device from your end and proceed with your question. Your line has been unmuted.
Sorry about that. Man, the old double mute. Kevin would thank. So, the whole concept we went into is, but for the EDAM, I have to reliably serve my load. And so I think the overriding principles, I should never be going into the market, RSC or otherwise, as a BA without the resources being, sufficiently reliable. So I think you're capturing it. And I think we've kind of expanded a little bit of the description of what would count. But I agree with Jeff and Jeff on the unit contingent as well, is that, if you have your own internal thermal resource, for example, I mean, you're going to rely on that, and you should be able to, unless you know it's not available or for whatever reason, it's offline. So anyway, apologize for being muted there.
No worries. Thank you for your comments there, Kevin. I see Anu. Go ahead, Anu.
Go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Mark, I just had a suggestion. I think it's a good question that Tom raised. I think the definition itself is provided by WEC, and it's defined as the product code itself is G-FC, which is a firm contingent product. So the word firm is in there. I just wanted to suggest that, maybe maybe it'd be helpful if we go back and look at that definition itself. I agree it cannot be cut for economic reasons. It can only be cut if the unit drops off. But if you compare that with EIM bids right now, that's essentially the same thing, right? You've got bids from different units, and if that unit falls off, that's considered or accounted towards your RSC in EIM right now. So just wanted to point that out.
No, thank you, Anu. I see Danny with his hand up. Go ahead, Danny. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think this discussion has been helpful. It seems like it's kind of a no-brainer that resources that are bidding into the EDAM within your own BAA could be counted. I think the complexity might be what would be necessary to count a specific resource that isn't under a RA or WSCP Schedule C contract and a different BAA for the EDAM RSC, just to make sure it's not getting double counted by both BAAs. So this has given us something to think on. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think this is all great discussion, so I appreciate everyone's feedback. Are there any other comments before we move on to the next slide here? I still see 3 hands up, Danny, Anu, and Kevin. If you still had something to state, please leave your hands up. If not, we will move on. I see Kevin, your hand is still remaining. Oh, there it goes. All right. All right, moving on to the next slide. All right, import resource adequacy. So again, I captured the slide based on my understanding. In red is really the feedback I'm looking for the audience. So import RA today consists of a load serving entity must hold import allocation, comes with a must offer obligation for the supplier, may be resource specific or system, and that obviously drives their must offer obligation. And then, my understanding is that these import RA contracts are comparable to a WSPP Schedule C arrangement. So with that being stated, I want to ensure that everyone understands and agrees or, get some common ground that it does make sense for these to be treated similarly to what these WSPP Schedule C arrangements are going to be treated like, counting towards the RSC. So let me pause there. California entities, feel free to raise your hand and chime in on whether or not these are comparable. Southwest, Northwest parties, feel free to chime in as well. I see Jeff Nelson with his hand up. Thank you, Jeff. Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Again, so yeah, I'm not sure if we should be saying Schedule C or if we should be saying firm. I would just have to go back and check with our folks, as there might be unit contingent in there, as we were talking about before, and that's not Schedule C. So the RA imports are treated as firm, I'd say, rather than Schedule C.
Okay, so they're, instead of Schedule C, they're highly reliable and firm. Is that a more accurate description?
Yeah, I think the actual PUC regs require it to be firm power.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. All right. Any other comments, thoughts on that? Tong Wu from WAPA. Go ahead, Tong.
Please go ahead. Please unmute the device from your end and proceed. Yes, please go ahead.
Tom, you may be muted on your side, sir.
Can you hear me?
Now I can. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. I have a question about must offer obligation. We have been talking about resource sufficiency evaluation, not RA evaluation. Right? The RA must offer obligation. I think the must offer obligation is for many hours. I forgot exactly, maybe 24 hours or 16 hours. I don't remember. There's a, a chunk of hours that you have to offer. For Schedule C, usually I can, sign a contract for a block on peak off peak. I might be able to sign a contract with some hours that are not a standard block. In that situation, I don't know I can meet your must offer obligation because your must offer obligation is for a long period of time. I don't know how that would work.
No, that's a good question there, Tong. And I think as far as the RSC accounting goes, to the extent there is a bid for that hour, that those megawatt volumes would be accounted towards meeting one's evaluation requirements. I see Jeff with his hand up again. Go ahead, Jeff.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, you were beating me to it. This is just the RSC. The RSC is different than our RA that has the long must offers, like you're saying. My understanding is RSC is hour by hour by hour. So to the extent there's a must offer, it's only the hour that the resource was shown for the RSC. That's my understanding.
Yep.
Yeah, that would be good. That would be good. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Tong, for your comments. All right, so, and maybe this is a question for you, Jeff. I'm not trying to pick on you. If a counterparty is engaging with a, system import, so it's not resource specific, I heard you say that it's a firm contract. From a timing standpoint, at what point does the load serving entity know the source? Event producer, do you mind unmuting Jeff's line? Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we ever know the source, if it's coming from sort of just a system power.
Okay. No, thank you. I appreciate you weighing in on that. I see Chris Devon from CES with his hand up. Go ahead, Chris.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in, just clarify on the import RA contracting. I definitely agree with Jeff Nelson in the sense that the unspecified ones, I think the off-taker wouldn't know. They would just know where you're bringing it in at. And then as far as the kind of subset of hours goes, import RA contracts can be done on a subset of hours, and then the must offer obligation is just established to those subset of hours. There are limitations on how many, like 5-hour, 8-hour contracts can count according to the PUC's MCC buckets, maximum cumulative capability buckets, but or capacity buckets, I forget. But just wanted to clarify those things, and I definitely agree with the way that you described it, and Tom's reaction to that for the RSC kind of portion of this. So I just want to chime in on that. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I do think, at least with my understanding and what we talked about with the Wsdp Schedule C arrangements, between that and import RA, it sounds like they're both firm, highly reliable. The point of delivery is known for both. I see Jeff with his hand up. Let's see what Jeff has to say. Go ahead, Jeff.
Please go ahead.
Mark. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I don't want to, trying not to wade into resource adequacy policy in this discussion. I think, we've talked about a few different things. Talked about Sched C contracts, talking about import RA. There could be other contracts as well that don't really fall into those specific buckets, but have similar attributes. And so I think from our perspective, the approach for determining how to count supply in a day-ahead test should be focused on what is a set of consistent criteria that we can use to do that. And so, not to belabor what I said before, but in our view, a bid by itself that isn't supported by any further information that identifies the source of that supply or how it's getting delivered to a particular location is not sufficient. In our view, what we should be focusing on is saying, whether it's an import RA contract, SCED-C, or something different, the expectation is that the source and the transmission should be known by the end of that day-ahead time frame at a minimum, so that there's comfort that those transactions, not only are they firm in terms of the contract, but they're actually supported by an identifiable resource, and we know where that's coming from, and that can be validated before getting into real time.
Yeah, so I think I understood your point just now, Jeff, and I believe you stated earlier that, there was that timing gap. So, for the purposes of RSE, we need to talk about in this form what counts and doesn't make sense to count. And then, whether it's later on in this form or in the overall stakeholder process, talk about what the expectations are for awarded schedules out of EDAM. I do know, and what I've heard in this form is many entities use these forms of transactions to meet their IRP and associated, their own quote unquote RA programs. So, we definitely want to respect that. I saw Danny's hand come up. Danny, did you have a comment or did you mean to put it down? Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm still struggling a little bit to tie that 3 p.m. day-ahead ETAG deadline to an RSC we're running at 10 a.m. I think if the concern is that there are unreliable imports that are being shown to pass the RSC, then I think that there could be other measures to test, independent of if there's a day-ahead ETAG or not. If those imports end up showing up in real time, that might be more accurate in assuring all the EDAM participants that the day-ahead imports ultimately do show up in real time.
Thank you, Danny. All right, any other comments or thoughts before we, I think we talked about this concept and thoughts quite a bit. I think the ISO team has a few things to go back and think about based on some of the comments they heard today. I will do some updating to some of the verbiage in these slides prior to posting. And then I think with that, we'll move on to consequences for failing. But before we do, I see Steve Greenleaf just raised his hand. Go ahead, Steve.
Please go ahead.
Steve, you may be muted on your side.
Yes, please go ahead. Your line has been unmuted. Kindly unmute the device from your side and proceed.
Still not hearing you, Steve. All right.
Sorry about that. Sorry.
Oh, there he goes. Yep,
yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry. It was double muted, but I was muted on the wrong device. Yeah, Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Just clarification to the point Jeff Spires made. It's really, well, I guess I want clarification. The presumption coming into this, right, is that, because he's right, a lot of this discussion could easily lead to detailed discussion on, in this case, the CAISO's RA rules. But the presumption in EDAM, right, is that EDAM obviously defers the RA rules to each individual EDAM BAA, and the presumption is whatever those rules are, they are, right? So, because otherwise, obviously, you can get into a very contentious discussion, including, is one BAA's RA rules comparable or equivalent to another's, and we don't want to get into that, I don't think.
Right.
Okay, so just wanted to make that point. And then just secondly, just confirming on your first sub-bullet point on the import allocation, you're still, that's really, once again, in the context of the CAISO rules and the MIC allocation, correct? Which is really
correct.
Just accounting convention. It has nothing to do with ties into bucket one transmission and whatnot, right?
Right. And the reason why I threw that in there was, the point of delivery is known, similar to these other arrangements. And I think what I heard from Milos was, the fact that these are firm transactions for purposes of counting towards RSC.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure you weren't trying to draw any relationship between the MIC, which is, of course, is done on a, if I recall correctly, a branch group basis versus kind of the, the bucket one and the pipes and straws between BAAs and how that's modeled. It doesn't sound like that's the case, so good.
Yeah, for clarification, I'm definitely not part of working group 2. I see Milos with his hand up, maybe to provide some clarification and answer to that, Steve. Event producer, if you wouldn't mind unmuting Milos's line, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. Please go ahead.
This is Milos for the ISO, and I can tackle as well your question, Steve, there as well. But yeah, I think in the, there's definitely then here we're talking about what counts, what accounts for in the resource sufficiency evaluation. I think the other item that's interdependent here and that we'll talk about then in the working group 2 is, recognizing some of these arrangements that are delivered firm energy at particular points that may be delivered on different types of qualities of transmission. How does that tie in then to the concept of bucket one transmission, making that available to support EDAM transfers if, some of these transactions, if there's not certainty as to the quality of transmission that they're being brought on. So I think we'll be tackling that and discussing that a bit more in working group 2 in an upcoming session, likely teeing some of that up maybe tomorrow as well. But I do want to come back just to the larger point, prior to that question of, the qualities of these transactions and kind of what we're talking about these arrangements. I think what I heard in the last 2 meetings here is that, and we need to be cognizant of this because I think this was also captured in the, it was the basis for the, some of the discussion in the common design principles on this topic, that I think there's a recognition that entities around the West depend on these types of arrangements for serving their everyday load, even outside of the EDAM. These are type of arrangements that they deem reliable, high quality arrangements that they depend upon to serve their load. Similarly to how the ISO depends upon RA imports that are delivered at particular tie points with the ISO to serve load, and these types of transactions are dependent upon that. Unless we found a way to figure out how do they account for in the resource sufficiency evaluation, I think parties would have a difficult time meeting that sufficiency evaluation. So I think this is a good discussion to continue, and maybe what we as the ISO, we can go back based on the discussion that we just heard over the last couple of times and maybe outline some of those qualities of these arrangements and see if there's a common set of qualities that, if met, those resources then, or those arrangements would be eligible for the resource sufficiency evaluation. Again, recognizing the level of dependence on these across the Western interconnection. And then, like I said, we'll need to have that parallel discussion then in working group 2 as well on how these are delivered and how does that fit within the context of bucket one transmission if these are used to demonstrate resource sufficiency. But I do want to just, again, leave the impression of what I heard early on when we started this is that this importance of these types of arrangements for meeting that load need. And if we're not able to find a way to account for these, I think there's a challenge here for meeting that resource sufficiency. So it's important that we get our heads together and talk through some of these concepts to see if we can come up with a framework, maybe of common qualities that will allow parties to have a reasonable chance at showing these and demonstrating that sufficiency.
Thank you, Melissa. Connie.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. I was one of the advocates, I guess, for questioning these types of agreements. But I do, I agree that they are what is used day in and day out. They are the type of arrangement that's used in the West, and they are considered firm agreements. What I think we're struggling with under the oath is whether they have the attributes of a network resource sufficient to reserve transmission in the absence of the disclosure of the upstream transmission. So it's a nuance that doesn't affect the validity of these agreements on a day-to-day basis. So our questions are going in a different direction. Also, I'd say that what we're concerned about in Nevada, I should have said I'm with the Nevada Commission, is whether these whether these agreements show up day in and day out. Do they show up on the important day, that day in July when there isn't enough, and they need to show up, and a liquidated damages clause does you nothing because it doesn't keep the lights on. So that's, I think, what we're struggling with, was a different nuance than, are these on a normal day sufficient? They are.
No, thank you for your comments, Connie, and I believe I heard similar comments on this past Monday. And if I recall, I think some of the responses we heard from some of the other entities were that they do show up, but I will let them chime in to that comment if they wish. If not, we can definitely table this for a later discussion. I see Paul Wood with his hand up. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Paul Wood with Pacificor. When we're short for our ability to serve our load in the pre-scheduled day, so I'm short tomorrow, and I'm short, say it's July 7th in 2021, and it's a peak load day across my system. I have to buy, in the BiLAP market, Wsdp Schedule C products. Those are as firm as I can procure. I fully expect those obligations to be there the next day. That's all I have to meet my obligation. Whether I lost a generator, whether loads came in heavy in the day ahead market, the VERS don't show up. That's why I'm transacting on these Wsdp Schedule C products, because I know they're as firm as I can get, and I fully expect them to be there. And there's a very high degree of performance. They will be there. I mean, it's well over 95%. It's probably 98% of the hours. That's going to be there.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate you responding to that. All right. Any other comments or thoughts before we move on? All right, moving on. I think we as a group understand what these arrangements look like, the firmness around them, and it sounds like most agree that those should account towards the RSC. So thank you everyone for your time on that. And ISO team, to the extent you want to put forward any examples or anyone else for that matter around this, Danny, you had 3 slides in Monday's call that kind of showed what these may or may not look like. So I don't know if there's, based on today's discussions, if there's any room for updating those slides and maybe bringing those back to this forum. So I just want to make that note. All right, next slide, please. All right, so Rsc failure consequences. I left this slide relatively vague. I tried not to add a bunch of detail. I really want to get stakeholder feedback on this. So to the extent an entity fails the resource efficiency evaluation, what action should be taken? Is it limiting participation of transfers? If any hour fails, the current thought from the ISO is to limit the failed hour to the bucket 1 transfer limit. Does that make sense? Should there be some financial penalties? Is it an hourly or daily assessment? Frequent failures. For frequent failures, should there be some progressive penalties? I really want to hear from the audience here on what their thoughts are, and let's go from there. I see Stuart from LA with his hand up. Thank you, Stuart. Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. I think when it comes to limiting participation, I think that has a role here, and that may be in certain scenarios where there's the potential for a party to, potentially rely on the market to fix some issues. That doesn't preclude necessarily the market resolving particular failures or coming up with products or whatever concepts that allow penalties to apply. But I think, limiting participation probably has a role to some extent. That doesn't, as I say, preclude the market curing a failure in certain instances. There's a lot of discussion about when that would kick in, oversight, because I think we've got to make sure that whichever penalties or construct, folks think may apply here, if they do think it applies, doesn't completely disincentivize parties from having an appropriate kind of RE program, if you will, and potentially over 2 or 3 years and during system stress conditions, which may only happen for certain hours, not necessarily take long-term actions they should have taken.
No, I thank you for your comment, Stuart. And one thing that I should have stated, and I apologize for not, is, one of those common design principles is whether it's limiting participation or some financial penalties, that definitely should not outweigh the benefits of participating in EDAM. So let me just make that statement as well. Can I get others to weigh in? Is the ISO's thought or proposal, and ISO team, please chime in if I didn't capture that right from earlier conversations, if to the extent an hour fails, the current thought from the ISO is to limit that failed hour to the bucket 1 transfer limit. I see Laura from BPA. Go ahead, Laura.
Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Laura Trelease from the Bonneville Power Administration. And just a question on the statement you made. I know it was one of the principles about if there were to be financial penalties, that they wouldn't outweigh the benefits that entities are receiving from EDAM. And I think when we tried to ask this, when we were going over the original set of principles, we were told it's a detail to be worked through the work group. So I'm hoping that we can get some clarity here on when you say benefits, what benefits are you referring to? Is it the production cost savings of EDAM? Because leaning can provide quite a bit of capacity savings. And so it's important to distinguish between, are you saying the failure consequences shouldn't outweigh the production costs, should be commensurate with the production cost savings or the capacity savings an entity would be receiving from potentially leaning?
No, good question there. And I'm actually going to see if Milosh is willing to chime in and opine on that. I see Milosh's hand up.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Milosh with the ISO. Thanks, Laura, for the question. I'll start, and then others can jump in that we're working on those principles. But we did not get into necessarily the level of detail of breaking down further the benefits. I think the overall concept was that the benefits derived from EDAM, should be balanced with the consequences of failure of the RSC. I think it was I think it brings us down to what's the size of that consequence, is it different if somebody is perpetually failing versus an occasional failure here and there? But it was more of looking at balancing the benefits of EDAM participation to that particular entity with the size or the type of consequence, that it's not so punitive in such a way that it completely eliminates the benefits of participation, or that it doesn't extend so long as to eliminate any of those benefits. It's just a general concept that was discussed without breaking it down further, but it was trying to strike this balance that it doesn't necessarily disincentivize participation in the EDAM of an entity based on the consequences of failing the RSC. And that's still subject to the discussions here, whether how the failures apply, how the consequences apply for a single failure versus, are there any considerations of consequences for perpetual failures or multiple failures across the time frame, and are there differences there? But hopefully that provides a bit more context. The intent was to capture that high-level concept of having some ability to compare or assess the structure of the consequence to the benefits that an entity derives from participation in the EDAM, and trying to find a balance that it doesn't disincentivize essentially EDAM participation.
Thanks, Milos. I don't know that helps. I think that is similar to what the concept, the high-level concept. I think what I'm trying to tease out is trying to get a little bit more detail around what benefits are being discussed here. And I guess I would just encourage the conversation to look at what capacity benefits, what capacity savings is an entity receiving from leaning on the EIM, and does it make sense to be talking about failure consequences in light of that, rather than just focusing on the potentially production cost savings that an entity is receiving from participating in EDAM, because those two things are very different.
Danny, I see your hand up. Did you want to chime in?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. So, yeah, I think what we're struggling with, Laura, is in a vacuum, the consequences should balance out with the production cost savings that each BAA would expect to derive from EDAM participation. The issue is that there is still the potential for, after the EDAM is run, for BAAs to go out and engage in bilateral contracting to cure deficiencies. So to the extent that the consequences are too extreme, then it could disincentivize EDAM participation, since I'm not sure the EDAM is the only means to cure a capacity deficiency in the day-ahead time frame, which is, I think, why we initially landed at just limiting participation, kind of acknowledging that there are other means to cure capacity deficiencies in the day-ahead time frame.
Yeah, I know there's different complexity around that, and I don't think we're opposed to limiting transfers. So it's just in the discussion around any kind of penalty structure, I think our concern has been the flip side of the coin, that it doesn't become that failing the RS test and leaning on the market becomes an economic alternative to proper forward procurement. And so I think those are just the things that need to be balanced in this discussion.
And that might be where some of the habitual. Go ahead, Danny.
I would just follow up and say, like, the Wsdps we talked about, and I think we heard Paul Wood talk about, like, if he projects to be short going into the next day, he's able to go and utilize that mechanism to cure a potential capacity deficiency. And so I guess I struggle to see how the EDAM would, not coming in resource efficient to the EDAM, in light of the fact that capacity deficiencies can still be cured intraday, would constitute or would really cut against adequate forward procurement.
Right. I think that's true if you're talking about limiting the transfers, and then that would cause someone to go and procure additional energy in the bilateral, but I guess my understanding of when we were talking about failure consequences is that you wouldn't necessarily limit the transfers, but allow those transfers at some penalty price, in which case then you're really looking at, do I take the penalty or do I go out and cure my deficiency?
Okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. I think I misunderstood slightly. I think where we landed initially is just limiting the transfers. I think what Mark is trying to convey is I think we're open to trying to figure out if there are appropriate financial penalties which kind of allow the EDAM to compete or be on equal footing with an entity's ability to intraday go and cure those capacity deficiencies. But what those look like, I think, is what we are trying to solicit stakeholder input on.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Danny. I saw Kevin Smith's hand go up and then go back down. Kevin, did you have a comment?
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
I did, and I didn't, and I did, and I didn't. So this is the conundrum. I mean, I think Laura's point is just very well taken, and also Stuart's point. And I know early discussions August 2020. We were going around on this issue too. I mean, it's a challenge. And I think that, in my mind, I keep coming back to, reliability and ensuring that if there's adequate supply and it's available out there, that needs to be the first step rather than just blocking transfers, which could cause an issue. Of course, it is a day ahead issue, so it's a little bit different, but I keep coming back to this kind of ratcheted concept where, and this goes to Laura's very good point, which is, it could become a supply option, right? If it's not properly constrained. And so, that seems like we have to at least be thinking about either limiting transfers, which I don't like as just a clear, the only option, but I do think there needs to be a combination which addresses, as some have called, serial or just kind of habitual leaning. But we have to get to that in this discussion, because this is kind of almost the raw nerve of this whole discussion is, if you're relying on certain resources or whatever it is, what's the penalty when these things don't show up or parties are, leaning on this market? And this has been a hard one to solve. In my mind, I still think it makes sense to consider kind of the upward ratchet that addresses kind of the longer term effects of an entity not supplying itself. But it's always easy to state that and then, okay, now what? So this is the hardest issue to resolve.
No, I appreciate your comments, Kevin. And if I'm looking for commonalities, which is, I think, what I'm doing as the facilitator, I think I heard both you and Laura support the idea of limiting a transfer, but it may need to go beyond that, kind of going back to your ratchet comment, as you put it. Let me hear from Paul Wood.
Can I just say I'm just really nervous about this reliability element, and I just don't want that to be, I think there needs to be some balance here, and so I'm not just saying just limit transfers. I think but we need to consider all these other elements, which could include, limiting at some point, after a demonstrable pattern and practice of doing something. But again, these are all hard things to define. Maybe Paul has all the answers, so I'll let him.
No, thank you for that clarification. So what I read here is kind of, limiting it to the bucket one transfer limit, which is what the ISO's original thought or, wanted to throw out there. Did I follow right that maybe we don't quite limit the transfer yet unless there's a, going back to that pattern of frequent failures, because you brought up the reliability aspect to where you may not want to, zero out or limit a transfer for reliability purposes to the extent it's, a quote unquote one-time failure. Is that where you were going with that, Kevin? Event producer, do you mind unmuting Kevin before I move on? Then I'll go to Paul Wood.
Yeah. I'm not smart enough to solve this problem.
No, understood.
All I'm saying is as I've thought about it, and it's like kind of the flipping, one side of the coin, the other side of the coin, and it seems like there's got to be something in between these two extremes, and I feel like we need some smart folks to input on this one because I think reliability is paramount, and that's what everybody's expressed. I mean, Jeff and Spire, Jeff Nelson, Laura, everybody, and, Stuart, everybody's focused on grid reliability. We don't want EDAM to lead to something, detrimental to grid reliability, period. So how do we protect that and preserve it? And I just think that, we have to consider something maybe beyond just a binary discussion between penalties and limited transfers. There may need to be some graduation, and this is going to take some deep thought and some folks that have a lot more, probably thought through it a lot more carefully.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate your thoughts and engagement. I really do. Let me go to Paul, and then I'll go to Dan.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Mark, Paul Wood, Pacific Core. I agree with the comments about there has to be consequences for failure. You definitely have to penalize poor performance or behavior. Another thought is there's a difference between a failure on July 6th of 2021 as opposed to failing in the middle of May. The consequences, or the impact are different, right? I mean, the system is definitely stressed on a hot summer day, as opposed to a middle of the spring. So I don't know whether that, somehow that could be woven into it as far as the penalty, based on system conditions.
No, I appreciate that thought. All right, let's go to Dan Williams.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks, Dan from Customized Energy Solutions. So as usual, I've been trying to break this down into thinking about it in the just context of the overall market design and what's trying to be achieved here. And I think kind of an opening question is just what this looks like in IFM versus across the day and getting into the RUC process and kind of differentiating between an EIM RSC where you have sort of limited opportunities to do things for reliability versus an EDAM RSC where there's still a lot that can be achieved. And when I think about the benefits for the EDAM, it's primarily that you're sort of expanding the opportunity for cost-based dispatch among sort of similarly situated entities that want to share in sort of the benefit of extending the pool of available resources under the understanding that everybody's doing what they need to do for forward procurement for transmission and resources before sort of engaging in that kind of mutually beneficial optimization. And I think when you get into RSC penalties, if your idea is to apply a limitation at the IFM, then that's sort of limiting an entities to sort of share in those benefits beyond their rightful contribution. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still additional supply out there that they can go out and pay a market price for to cure that. And that may be For some entities that may be going out and purchasing bilaterally between IFM and RUC or between RUC and real time. Could be arranging gas on a higher price unit or bringing something back off of an outage that is, well above market or something like that. But I guess I'm just kind of challenged a little bit by the idea that limiting transfers in IFM has a reliability tinge to it, just because there's still sufficient time to kind of go out and access other resources at non-EDAM cost-based prices for entities to sort of pay the penalty of not having procured them, not by leaning on the EDAM, but by sort of leaning on a market that you expect is in some ways still there, though we also have to identify what market is still actually going to be there if EDAM is a very comprehensive market. And I guess I'm thinking more in the context of maybe the early years where EDAM has a footprint, but maybe it isn't the ultimate footprint. So there's still sort of supply out there that's not completely wrapped up in the EDAM optimization.
I follow you. Thank you, Dan. Let's go to Alva.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hello, this is Elvis Faboda from PG&E. Just to raise a slightly different perspective on this, I think the consequence of limiting transfers within hours in the same day's IFM is going to lead to unwanted consequences in the optimization in terms of commitment of resources that might have nothing to do with the area that's being penalized. And likewise, in terms of how storage is used in the EDAM. I would, I think the idea of penalties or even of looking at this as something that needs to be sanctioned after the fact of the market or even in future market activity might be a better approach than trying to do it algorithmically within the day, the market of the day, because you really can't foresee what the effects of such a limit are going to be on all the elements of the solution, in my opinion. Thanks.
Nope. Good point there, Alva. That's definitely something to think about for the group. Thank you. Let me go to Todd Ryan. I haven't heard from Todd. Go ahead, Todd.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Todd Ryan, Pacific Gas and Electric. Just to add on to Alva just a little bit, I think we're all recognizing that this is trying to assess the degree to which people are leaning day ahead is very nuanced. It's different if the system is stressed and there's no economic energy out there. It's different if it's not stressed and there's economic transfers to be made. It's different if the person has set up their resources 45 days in advance and is all ready to go and does its best efforts day ahead to be sufficient, and then something out of its control happens versus someone who doesn't have their act together and is scrounging for energy at the last minute. So I agree that we should open up our mind to assessing these, maybe not all in one, all-encompassing test day ahead. We may want to look at, like Alva alluded to, an ex-ante analysis. We may want to think about making the consequences conditional on the overall footprint conditions. We just might have to open up our perspective a bit that we can't just take the EIM consequences and just move it 50 ahead, maybe. So appreciate your feedback and thoughts on that.
Oh, thank you, Todd. I appreciate your remarks. Let me go to Stuart Kelly.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just on that first sub-bullet, just to be clear, and building on Alva's point, and there may be unintended consequences. I think what I would say is there's definitely a role for limiting participation when that kicks in. Not entirely sure if it's on an ex-ante basis or whatever, whatever's appropriate. But I think it's just the point being that there has to be some disincentive to prevent folks to try and, to lean and make the right decisions. So on the first sub-bullet, I would say that probably isn't right, but it's contingent on, and the penalties and what they would look like, and probably contingent also on, is it ex ante or what process is going to get used to potentially cure for certain hours. So I think it's just generally the limiting participation applies to, let's call it serial offenders or whatever. But how that would get ultimately applied is going to be subject to the discussions around penalties.
Gotcha. And I think I've heard multiple parties now reference, serial offenders. Does that mean there's a threshold, percentage of hours failed threshold before any penalties apply? And when I say penalties, I mean, limiting of participation and or financial penalties on top of that, or whatever comes to light through this discussion. I just wanted to throw that out there. Good point, Stuart. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think there's got to be some measure of when transfers do get limited. I don't know what exactly that measure is right now, but critically it gets back to making sure folks are going to make the correct long-term decisions and not enter this with, short-term, I'm going to lean this summer. If they know ultimately the transfers are going to be limited, they'll be forced to make the right decisions.
Gotcha. Thank you, Stuart. Danny Johnson from the ISO, did you have a thought or comment?
Thanks, Mark. So I thought I almost heard some callers kind of coalescing around the idea of initially not limiting transfers and then trying to, after the fact, either assign some type of administrative or derived charge to the entity who failed the RSC in the hour they failed it. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, I heard something similar, and I think it was one of the parties was Dan Williams from CES, just to not necessarily, it may or may not impact resource commitment. And Dan, feel free to raise your hand if that's not accurate, or others to the extent you want to chime in on that. I see Dan's hand up. Go ahead, Dan.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think others were more kind of saying that. My comment was more that if you do limit transfers in IFM, you're sort of just limiting an entity's ability to share in the economic benefits because they haven't crossed the threshold, but that doesn't mean that they can't take other actions to become reliable, both long-term taking other actions, but then just in the short term going out and making market purchases either as a BA operator or as individual LSEs at a market-based rate that presumably would be above what the benefit that they would be getting in sort of sharing in the rates that you expect to come out of EDAM or taking other actions, exceptional dispatch, whatever, to ensure they're reliable going into real time.
Thank you, Dan. So from some of the, go ahead, Danny. I was going to pose a question. I think you're going there too. I'll let you do it. Go for it.
No, yeah, I think that from the ISO's perspective, to the extent we cannot limit participation and limit transfers, that is beneficial because, like Alva noted, it could lead to some non-optimal results coming out of the optimization. I guess we try to do this after the fact. I think trying to derive an administrative penalty, given that there's a bilateral market that tries to kind of thread that needle, try to proxy that bilateral market may not be straightforward. Are there ideas that the stakeholder community might have about how the ISO could try to develop that counterfactual of what that capacity that they access through the EDAM would have been in the bilateral market?
Good question. I've seen Jeff Spire's hands up for a while, and then I'm going to go to Kathleen Colbert. So Jeff, if you don't mind first seeing if you could shed any light on Danny's question, and then go ahead and provide your comment if it was different.
Please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Mark. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. I'd have to think through a little bit more what Danny was getting at around a counterfactual, but maybe what I would say to that is that, from my perspective, I think it's coming down to a lot of what we've already talked about in terms of structuring the test itself the right way, because I think what we've talked about so far is that the forward markets will continue to exist. The day-ahead bilateral market will continue to exist. And we were having a conversation earlier today about including those types of transactions between entities within the test. And I think the other thing that we've talked about quite a bit is ensuring that the sufficiency test structure and requirements are clear and well defined. So, from my perspective, it seems like that if all of those elements are there, entities should be able to pass the day-ahead test. And I think instances of failing the day-ahead test and then having to sort that out in real time should be limited, because really the information, the tools, the capability to make transactions should all be there in advance of the day-ahead test. So ideally, I think we would be focused on trying to get those elements right. My broader comment was going to be that, first of all, I think there's been some great comments and just a lot of different perspectives, but obviously emphasizing this is a tough issue. And I appreciate the CAISO putting forward a couple of ideas to kind of help get the conversation started. But I would suggest that we try to focus somewhat on what do we need to achieve and what do we need to avoid in terms of whatever we do end up with in terms of a design. I think number one, avoiding causing or adding to a reliability issue is something that I think we would all agree on is really important. And that was an issue that came up at the board last week in the context of the EIM as well. And so there's going to need to be conversations about how do we structure EIM consequences better to avoid some of those concerns. And we certainly don't want to raise them here. So I think that's a priority that we need to be keeping in mind, obviously. But the second one, too, back to what Laura said towards the beginning that I just wanted to agree with and re-emphasize is addressing the economic incentives to lean, because that really is the challenge here. The potential incentive to access capacity savings through the market, inappropriate capacity savings, could be significant, and the long-term nature of that in terms of the ability to avoid either building or forward contracting as opposed to paying an hourly cost to fill in a shortfall on 1 hour here and there could be significant. And so we have to find a way to address that incentive issue and encourage the entities to take the appropriate steps up front to pass the test. So I just, I don't have necessarily ideas on what exactly the right solution should be, but at least seeing if we can come to some agreement on what the elements are of a design that are necessary and what we need to accomplish would be a good start.
Gotcha. No, I thank you, Jeff, for your comments. Danny, I saw your hand go up. Did you have a response to that?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So I heard Jeff kind of bring up the topic of leaning in the EDAM, and that's something I'm still struggling with. I think our initial thought of limiting participation would mean that any entity who fails that hour is no worse off because they can still access the bilateral market to cure that insufficiency in whatever hour they fail. So I guess I don't totally understand if transfers are limited for failure, how the EDAM could be used to lean, since that same ability to cure that deficiency currently exists today in the day-ahead time frame. I think the potentials for leaning do become a little more prevalent, like as we start to walk down, should those transfer limitations be relaxed and transfers be allowed, because then we do have to try to get the right price that reflects the actual value of that energy to cure that deficiency during the hour or hours that an entity could potentially fail.
Thank you, Danny. Let me go to Kathleen. Kathleen, I appreciate your patience.
Please go ahead.
No, yeah, of course. Thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. No, thank you. Really interesting conversation. I appreciate everyone's thoughts on this topic. This is definitely a hard one. I agree with those comments. Like, this is, I feel like, the meat of everything. I keep saying, I want to know what the failures are so I can think through the elements of the test. I'm not going to duplicate things that others have said, so I want to just kind of add a couple of thoughts, maybe tease some stuff out that I'd like the group to think about further, if I may ask that favor. I think that we've been what I hear is we're talking about the limiting of participation. So I'll tackle that sub-bullet first from the perspective of a single area being short. In the EDAM context, I think my current thinking is that limiting the participation within an hour, if a single EDAM BAA, it has insufficient resources to meet their needs, is overly harsh of a result for EDAM because of all the stuff you're hearing. But I do want to carve out a little space at some point for us to consider the edge case. The edge case that it's not the EDAM, but it's not the EDAM BAA, it's the entire footprint that's at risk of being short, even if there were no transfer limitations. So just cross the area, the market's going to somehow fail. This is a huge edge case. So I have not been thinking about the more durable solution or kind of like more general solution as needing to address limiting. But I did want to acknowledge and say that, and I think it may have been, I'm looking back at my notes, I think it was Todd Ryan who mentioned thinking about the consequences kind of in context of the overall footprint. That has been on my mind also. To me, that's an administrative action, right? So if in advance of, in the day ahead, the CAISO identifies there's a massive risk of footprint-wide reliability issues, I think we need out-of-market actions at that point to address that going into a real time. If that is a true concern of this group that we want to tackle, I think it's a slightly separate scope than what the normal kind of recurring Rsc consequences. But it's fair to bring it up and say that we should maybe carve time in a later meeting to discuss that edge case. The second thing that I'd say, okay, so now back in normal, on normal operations for EDAM, I am walking into it with the assumption that the overall footprint has sufficient resources to solve the EDAM optimization problem. The question is within this footprint, so if we were a full RTO and that's what we were pursuing, then we would look at that and say that's a diversity benefit. We're going to be able to have a more optimal, efficient outcome. Great. So you wouldn't want to limit the transfers, right, within zones within a full RTO because we want to access that diversity benefit. It produces more benefits out of the market solution. We've been spending a lot of time taking a step back and saying, okay, well, absent of a full RTO in an EDAM construct, how do we think about leaning? And I think I've asked some questions in prior workshops on it, but where we're coalescing is that assume the system is sufficient overall in the footprint, and then we'll have that separate conversation maybe at a later date about that assumption breaking down. But assume it's sufficient, and we're really talking about, well, there is a diversity benefit, but that means that in certain areas, if they were to be dispatched alone, they'd be short. Other areas dispatched alone would be long. And so the appropriate incentives to kind of drive an EDAM that has sufficient resources would be to charge at a sufficiently, like, I don't want to say high, but like an appropriate value. Danny, you mentioned ideas around that, and I will defer that to next meeting if that's all right. But an appropriate value to charge to areas that would be short, absent of the transfers. But then I also want to add to the scope of this conversation, reallocating those charges to the areas that were long. This is the way that we could really talk about what's the diversity benefit, and under an EDAM, what's the right way to incentivize diversity benefits, but then to also incentivize areas that are leaning on those benefits to be charged an appropriate penalty so that they're incentivized to contribute to that. And I think that kind of gives a really nice feedback loop that addresses the leaning from an EDAM perspective that would make this market durable and healthier over the long term. Feeds into the forward incentives, and it recognizes diversity benefits of the footprint appropriately by charging and then allocating to those who provide them. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I just wanted to add those thoughts to this discussion.
No, thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate your comments. I see Danny with his hand up, and then I'm going to go to Alva. I do want to recognize the time, so if you guys both don't mind keeping your comments brief, I'd appreciate it, and then I'll turn it over to Bob. Go ahead, Danny.
Sure, Mark. So thanks for your comments, Kathleen. To your first point, I do think we want to consider what happens if the entire EDAM footprint is short. I think we're planning on deferring that to the latter stages of these working groups on kind of more of the confidence in EDAM transfers and priority section. So that is something that we are looking to do. On the allocation, I totally agree. Any financial consequence that would be assessed, we would want to make sure that it's allocated back to the BAAs who are helping to cure that deficiency. And I do think it gets a little tricky if it's pro rata, or no, pro rata is not tricky actually, but when you start considering the transmission that's made available that helps facilitate potentially curing those deficiencies, it is a little more complicated. So I think that is something that we need to give more thought to.
Thank you, Danny. All right, let's go to Alva, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Alva, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Alvis Ferota, PG&E. I just wanted to raise sort of along the lines of what Kathleen was talking about. I think a couple of concepts which perhaps are not that popular in CAISO's activities around capacity could be used in some way in addressing this. The idea of the RAIM substitution and of CPM for the concept of a kind of CPM activity for repeated shortfalls on the Rsc. Just since you've developed those concepts to some extent already, you might want to think about those in terms of how those could be used rather than to address specific needs as you come across them in the daily running of the market. I don't know if that's clear, but it occurred to me that those are although they don't apply necessarily in this economic context, there are similarities that you could potentially use.
Yeah, you're proposing some type of backstop mechanism for the entire EDAM footprint.
Right, done by the CAISO, that's right.
Okay. No, I think I heard that, noted it, and I would definitely like comments back on that this coming Monday.
Sharing of benefits also.
Right. Thank you, Alva. All right, Bob, sorry to eat into a little bit of your time. Let me turn it over to you for a summary of today's discussion.
Okay, I'll do my best here. Lots of discussion, mainly at the first part of the meeting about the WSDP Schedule C arrangement review. Seems to be general agreement that the energy's firm, although there may need to be some clarification about the definition of firm. The timing of the source and transmission path generally known to align with the 3 p.m. tagging requirement. Point of delivery generally known in time for bid submission, where I think we would expect bids to be submitted for these resources with a delivery point identified. Certainty of delivery is generally high with concerns on stress days. There's a discussion about a concept of putting together a draft timeline with when certain activities are taking place to help shape the understanding. And then also some discussion about the concept of an EDAM 101 for overall understanding. We talked a little bit about the import resource adequacy and a comparison with the WSDP Schedule C arrangements. And then we finished the discussion with the failure consequences. Lots of ideas floated around. I'm not sure we had any consensus, so I'm expecting that to continue in our next meeting. And I'll hand it back to you, Mark, with that.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it, and I really do appreciate everyone's engagement on this. I do agree this is going to be a very important topic for the group to come to some common ground on. So I encourage for you to, maybe reach out to some of your counterparties, see what ideas you guys may come up with, and then reach out to me to the extent you're comfortable presenting on some of those proposals or ideas to get the conversation started this coming Monday. With that, I will give you guys the rest of your afternoon back. Thank you again for your time, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.